I singled out some really powerful buildings and some ideas that the ancient Egyptians created. But before we talk about Egypt, Minoan, and Mycenaean culture, we're going to be talking about, there's a wonderful image. I'm not sure how this photograph was done, but those are, of course, the famous pyramids, one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, and they are absolutely wonderful and extraordinarily large and hard to believe they're actually built by people. They're built for gods and for the afterlife. But anyway, before we go further, we're going back to tens of thousands of years of architecture, the world's creation and its inhabitants. I'm going to talk about the world of drawing as a way of communication. Because we're going to be talking about Egypt, Minoan, Sumerians, their early formations of text, writing, communication. The first thing I want to show you is the cave paintings of Lascaux, France, roughly 15,000 BC to 3,500 BC. Of course, 3,500 BC really begins the early formations of the Egyptian culture. Historians have said that the cave paintings go back to 45,000 BCs. But of course, we're only succumbed to radiocarbon dating, forgot the age, so we're just kind of roughly putting a huge time frame on these. Hieroglyphics really in ancient Egypt began around 3,500 BC, ancient Greece, 800 BC, into a formal alphabet. So what we're looking at is that should have been 14,000 years of drawing. We didn't have a formal language. It took 14,000 years of drawing to communicate to people until we have a formal alphabet, really established by the ancient Greeks, cultures and studies from 800 BC. This is remarkable to think about. Of course, here is a picture of the famous cave painting in Lascaux, France. These were not decorative paintings. These were telling the people of this, of course, in this cave, what animals to run from, what animals to fight, what animals to hunt and eat. So you can imagine these were in a small cave that would have fires going. This is a very, very primitive form of video animation. If you can imagine the flames being flickered, you could see the animals moving because the flames were moving themselves. So this is kind of a really wonderful sort of video of telling the story about how to communicate with people that were, still in a stage of survival, which I just find really remarkable. So here are some, deer and some other, this is way before they had a standardized system of symbols and characters to tell people stories. So we're still relying on paintings and drawings to sort of establish a language of communication. It wasn't really until the cuneiform, the ancient Sumerians, I'm thinking this is probably several thousand years later after the cave paintings, but we're still not seeing a standardized alphabet. We're seeing characters and drawings to communicate information to people. So here we go. This is ancient Egypt, probably 4,000, 3,500 BC. We can see graphic pictorials. We're seeing people, strangely enough, represented by only the profile. You rarely ever see a frontal portrait or picture because they're not portraits. They're telling stories because this is their language. They're using characters. You can see the bird, symbols to represent meaning. It wasn't until the archaeologist, discovered the Rosetta Zone that sort of broke and had to sort of understand what these characters meant. But very interesting and very kind of enigmatic way of showing people and characters. Talking about the language of drawing, this is an extraordinary drawing of the ancient Sphinx, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. This is a wonderful engraving and ink drawing of the Great Sphinx in ancient Egypt. And of course, this is with her nose being damaged by earthquakes and other sort of extraordinary and very serious Mother Nature consequences of having earthquakes, fires, and floods, which we'll see over the history. But when we talk about the language of drawing, this drawing communicates light, shade, power, and a certain amount of enigma. And of course, the statue of this pharaoh's face. And I love to see Egyptian architecture in old black and white photographs. You have to imagine when archaeologists came to visit this roughly in the 1700s, 1800s, they had it was very difficult to get to these places and study them. It was, of course, very hot. The sunlight was so intense. we have to sort of thank them for all of their geographical endeavors in getting these places and sort of enlightening the world about how extraordinary this culture is. So there's just some maps. So here we are. We're going to be talking about, ancient Greece. We can see Athens. Egypt is the very northern part. We're going to be talking about Crete, the island between Greece and Egypt. We're going to be talking about Minoan civilizations. It's pretty much inhabited by the only island one of the few islands there are ancient Crete. Here is, of course, the Egyptian society structured around the, of course, the Nile River, Lower and Upper Egypt. We have an extraordinary plan of the pyramids and plan. Now, of course, in terms of composition, we're looking at an emphatically orthogonal relationship of fields. We really don't see curves. We're definitely not looking at domes. They didn't know how to build curved spaces, and certainly not domes. This is way before the ancient Roman civilization created concrete. So we're looking at pretty much, for the most part, hard-fired mud clay. Everything was built with the sand and the clay that they had on site. This is the ultimate in sustainability in architecture. Here's kind of a map showing where Egypt is, of course, obviously associated with the Nile River. Why would they even establish a society in the desert with no water reservoir? Okay, so before we look at each one of the buildings, we're looking at ancient Egypt, 3000 to 32 BC, 3,000 years of art. This is not art as a decorative process. This is art as an integral process to tell stories because people really couldn't read. Of course, they really built for pharaohs and, of course, the ultimate afterlife. You would think that the sun was so relentless and inspiring that they would have a more of an optimistic outlook on life, but of course they're obsessed with the afterlife. So all these buildings really were built for the pharaohs, of course, the afterlife after they pass away. We're looking at dynasties, roughly 30 different dynasties in the world of Egyptian architecture, many different. I just listed a few of very famous pharaohs, queens, and dignitaries that occupied ancient Egypt for roughly 3,000 years. Of course, the famous one is Cleopatra. She is really the one that ended the great ancient Egyptian civilization. She ultimately killed herself, and her suicide ended the very last dynasty. So we have is 3,000 years of pretty much mud-fired buildings, bronze, gold, some precious stones that were imported from other regions of the world. But what we're looking at in architecture in ancient Egypt is emphatically subtractive and additive. This is one of our few cities in the world where we see a clear distinction between additive and subtractive constructions. So we're looking at the orthogonal. The triangle is a very powerful geometric tool. They're not just a geometric tool, they're ancient symbols of philosophy. And a lot of these buildings were associated, of course, aligned with astronomy and, of course, the stars and the constellation. They had nothing to do but look at the sun and the stars all day and all night long. So we're going to be seeing the organization of these based on, of course, the orthogonal, the triangle, and of course, ultimately, really the only way they built things was with the post and lintel construction. So we're looking at very few curves. Here is an extraordinary picture of how powerful the large triangle can become a three-dimensional construct. So when we talk about subtractive, this is, I think it's Ramses' tomb. This is absolutely unbelievable. There's nothing additive. They carved these, what's called these earlier caryatids. They probably didn't have that term because the ancient Greek society established the caryatids as a columnar order in 450 BC. So, but this is carved out of a solid block. And of course, the characters of hieroglyphics are not decorative elements. They are telling the story about who occupied this tomb. This, of course, a funeral grave site to honor the afterlife. But this is just, you can see that the figures are subtracted out of the strata, the horizontal layers of the stone. Nothing is added in terms of ceramics or mud-fired bricks. But for someone to use primitive tools, of course, they Now again, the Bronze Age, they're mixing tin and copper. Those are relatively very thin, brittle materials, but when the ancient Egypts merged them together, they have very strong physical characteristics. They used them for tools of weapons. They used them to carve and use chisels. This is just absolutely extraordinary. And these are giants. I'm going to show you a picture that has the scale of these. These are just really remarkable. Um, of course, they weren't considered sculptures. I mean, these were parts of the tomb and parts of the entire facade is nothing but sculptures. They're really not a facade. So we talk about post and lintel construction. This is what's called the hypostyle hall. I'll talk about that in just a minute. But you can see that the post, they had some marble, they had some limestone, but of course the hypostyle, the post and lintel construction, they weren't able to span very far. So we're using wood, timber, some wood, because there really weren't a lot of trees there. So we're looking at some imported limestone, some marble that was delivered from probably Assyria or India to span the difference between the columns. But this is just an extraordinary architectural construct and very primitive tools. Here's another 3D view of this. You can see the scale of the people. These are giant sculptures, if not buildings. Not only that, they were able to carve what's a bas relief, which of course is a short relief. These are a mixture of hieroglyphics and physical carvings to explain stories, because of course they didn't have a formalized written language. I'm just going to show this. Of course, they were able to use gold and lapis lazuli, which is a very imported stone. For a primitive culture to make something like this is absolutely just incredible. If you really want to see, this of course is Elizabeth Taylor. She's in a 1965 production. I think Cecil B. DeMille was this extraordinary director that directed and created this extraordinary movie. Of course, it was considered a costly flop because the movie was so bad, yet so wonderful, into a window of what Egyptian culture looks like in its last dynasty, of course, with Elizabeth Taylor decorated as an Egyptian goddess in the very last dynasty, roughly 69 to 35 BC. You have to remember that the first century AD, of course, we're looking at the Pantheon in Rome. So we're still looking at post and lintel primitive constructions, because we're not building really with larger spans, and of course, definitely not concrete in ancient Roman societies. There again, there's some, they're not frescoes, they're paintings, probably ink and mud, and probably burned sticks to make the characters for the hieroglyphics. We looked at the ancient pyramids just from the elevation, but for the most part, they're really not that great of architectural marvels. The size is extraordinary, but really the interior is really a burial tomb. The section of the pyramids shows that there's an incredible system of interlocking hallways that are not even visible from the outside. These are burial tombs. They're so far disassociated from the outside world. Of course, that's the beauty of them. The pharaoh needs to be buried away from the entire world. So it's really difficult to visit and see these. There's a long passageway. You can imagine visiting these in ancient Egypt in the summer. I'm sure the temperature was off the charts, but ultimately, look at what, construction architecture can do in 3000 BC. Again, these were made of mud and bricks, but of course they were faced with marble. So you can imagine, at least if I can find an earlier image of the pyramids, you'll have to bear with me. These used to be faced with white marble. You can imagine the size of these, and coming to Egypt and visiting these deities and seeing these incredible pyramids glowing in the sunlight with these. It must have been an absolutely awe-inspiring image to even see. Of course, the guts of the building is pretty much stacked mud bricks and probably fired clay, but the inside is really not for a visitor. It's really for the afterlife. That's one hell of a building, really not to be invited and visited by visitors, really mostly people that constructed that. But that's just an extraordinary architectural marvel. And it is one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. So let's take a look at hieroglyphics. I do want to show this image. We talked about hieroglyphs. Of course, they are carvings in granite. These are, of course, the famous obelisk that used to be in Egypt. You can see them dispersed in the city of Rome, which we'll talk about later after the Renaissance. For somebody to carve, now this is not soft lines, this is a very hard stone granite. Of course, again, the characters are telling the language and the stories before they had a systemized form of language. So these are very difficult to carve in. I'm just going to show these are some of the columnar orders. This is way before they had, Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. That was really established by the Greeks. The ancient Egyptians had their own language of capitals and orders. These are stylized papyrus or papyrus leaves. So the capitals visibly describe the transition from the shaft and, of course, the beam above that as these leaf-like forms. And they're polychromed and just absolutely extraordinary. Of course, they're only seen not in color, but the rough sandstone that we see in, of course, the stone and the mud in Egypt. I'm going to show you this when I'm talking about the obelisk. You're probably wondering, what is this drawing? And when I was studying architecture, I thought this was like a locomotive or some sort of steam engine, but look carefully, this is how they actually lifted the obelisk from the ground. Now, the obelisks are not carved standing up with little Egyptian, they're not slaves. The Egyptians hired their citizens and paid them to build things. They really were not slaves doing this, but this is roughly, I'm showing you this is how the obelisk is carved out of solid block of granite or stone on the ground. Then after they carve the hieroglyphics in, they have a way of lifting this huge obelisk from the ground up into the air. You have to understand that, we don't have metal cranes and steel to do this. These are engravings showing how the obelisks were lifted off the ground. Now, this is actually an engraving showing how the obelisks were transported from ancient Egypt into Rome during Pope Sixtus V's plan of Rome. Remember, in Rome is that the Pope decided to install obelisks as a way of orienting people through the city of Rome. He actually established these parallel alleys, or not alleyways, but these alley of buildings to sort of, you can associate your place in Rome by the obelisks are placed in front of sacred churches and piazzas. But for the most part, and there's a wonderful book on how the mystery of making and lifting these obelisks up. This looks like a little tiny dot in the landscape of ancient Egypt, but they are monumental pieces that still are baffling for how these were actually carved, cut out of the ground, and lifted into place. Then you have to think about, where do they get the trees to make way for the scaffolding and the lifts? Because we're in the middle of a desert. I'm sure they probably fell millions of trees outside the periphery to make this happen. It's still really baffling to me to think that, a society that's made of sand and mud can find trees and make these scaffolding structures. Anyway, so we need to move on. So the architecture really of ancient Egypt is, of course, a mixture of pyramids, mostly tombs, temples at Thebes, the famous hypostyle hall. Of course, the walls with hieroglyphics. The walls are not, of course, the walls do explain the language and the narrative of the culture, but of course, they're really written with hieroglyphics. So you can see these are not decorative elements. These are telling a story because, of course, people didn't read back then. Only the enlightened scholars were able to carve the hieroglyphics and explain the stories to the citizens of Egypt. You can see that the pharaohs are there painted onto the wall, if not carved in. So let's take a look at the structure and the architecture of these temples. Of course, this is a temple not for the citizens of ancient ancient Egypt. These are burial for the dead pharaohs, and these are tombs. These are really tombs for the dead. So we're looking at, of course, the post and lintel construction because they didn't really have a way of spanning long distances. So the columns, when we look at ancient Egypt architecture, we earlier compared Greek structure and Roman structure because, of course, the Greek structure, the columns are very close together because they didn't have the structural capacity to span a very long distance between the columns. So if you see a large span, it's open to the sky. Now, the hypostyle hall is a series of columns. Hypostyle means it's under the ceiling of columns. So we look at early Egyptian space and structure, looking at very close columns together because, of course, due to the lack of materials to span farther, and I don't have this, there is a primitive scale, you can see 10 or 20 feet, but you can't span 50 feet or 100 feet because we're not building with concrete and domes. So, and also in 3000 BC to carve columns like this, it must have been a Herculean task to do this. These are enormous pieces. Some of them are carved out of a solid block the same way the obelisks are done. They're not carved standing up, they're carved on the ground and then decorated and subtracted for the hieroglyphs and then lifted into place. So when I look at something like this, the work that goes into constructing this is absolutely remarkable. They only had 3,000 years to do this, but of course it took many years of experimentation, a lot of catastrophes, but we still have some of the remnants of what these places used to look like. So we're looking at it, again, as mentioned earlier, we're not looking at curves and circles. Really, the ancient cultures really use, of course, the sacred orthogonal field, because, of course, we're looking at a very clear system and ordering of parts of the architecture. Sorry, this slide is a little blurry. So we have the Great Sphinx. This is carved. This is not built up. This is subtracted out of layers of strata of mud and sand and some stone. It's a mixture. But we're looking at this incredible Sphinx-like sculpture that is subtracted out of the ground, not built up. This is built for the famous pharaoh Khafre, roughly 45 to 3000 BC. Again, pretty much all these structures are really built thousands of years, of course, before Christianity was introduced. But we're looking at, carved by hands and probably thousands of citizens, not slaves, to make this outstanding sculpture. Here is one of the temples. I think this is the temple, the Hypostyle Hall at Thebes. But look at the size. It's interesting. The ancient Egyptians, they taper the walls. I'm not really sure if this is a structural element, but this is probably a certain amount of articulation. They're way beyond the stage of survival. So they have, they can carve the language out. They can taper the walls a certain amount of optical articulation. But the size of the gate is absolutely monumental. These are just breathtaking. It's really hard to see the scale in person. And there is a detail obviously we're seeing that it used to be faced with marble. Other societies and cultures remove the marble to make other buildings. It's pretty ballsy to think I'm going to go to Egypt. We're just going to take them and steal the marble off to make other buildings as a way of just kind of insulting the pharaohs that these incredible tombs were built for. But nonetheless, this is what the pyramids look like today. We just have reconstruction renderings of the pyramids that were used to be faced with marble. Obviously, this is another temple. It's interesting that the columnar order, this is way before the Greeks established the classical orders, Doric and Corinthian. They had their own language of capitals. These are based on plant-like form. These are probably the vertical reeds that create the papyrus leaf form. And of course, these are monumental columns. You can see the span couldn't be that far. You really can't span that far with stone or glazed ceramic or any sort of material beyond concrete. This is just an extraordinary photograph of a mixture of carved pharaohs and, of course, but notice they're not just incised onto the obelisk. There's a three-dimensional bas-relief, and a bas-relief is a very thin, short, low-relief carving. They could have just quickly etched in lines, but they were very passionate. Of course, the three-dimensional quality tells more of a story than just the linear carving that could have been done quickly. But of course, these are all just remarkable feats of carving and structure. Let's take a look. This is another famous queen, Queen Hatshepsut's temple. Half of this is carved, subtracted out of the rock formation, the stone in Egypt. Of course, the other columns are added. So it's a mixture of subtractive, but look at the processional ramp that the queen would actually inhabit from leaving the outdoor space in Egypt, and of course in her own private temple. But just for someone to build something at this scale 3,000 years ago is just really remarkable. Of course, we're looking at, of course, the post and lintel type of construction because we're not using concrete or limestone to build. We're going to be looking at an early sort of type of dome construction topology in a little bit later, but we're still, the entire city is built up of a post column and beam, very primitive. And they were so happy building in this sort of post lintel construction because they were still using what I'm considering very primitive materials built in a very sophisticated way. So we're going to leave ancient Egypt for a minute. We're going to move to the Olive Crete. Hopefully, I think there is a map of, let me see if I can find these. Let me go back for a minute. Sorry, my slides are not the most organized. Okay, so we're going to be, so Egypt is here at the bottom. And Crete is between Greece and Egypt. It's an island all on its own. The early inhabitants probably began around 8,000 BC. Let me shift back to, okay, the ancient island of Crete. This is the famous island that has, of course, the palace for the Minotaur. The inhabitants were the Neolithic period, roughly 8,000 BC. The Minoans were inhabitants roughly 3,000, and these are just approximate dates, which of course 2000 BC houses. I like to show the different times because Egypt and ancient Crete and the Minoans were sort of overlapping the time frame. So we're looking at roughly 2,000 years, the house of the Minotaur. We're still using post and lintel. The trabeated system is a fancy term for the post and beam construction. We're going to be looking at one of the earliest domes we've seen in the entire world of architecture or construction. There is, I like to call them a cast of characters. We looked at Egypt 3000. Sir Arthur Evans was an archaeologist that was very devoted his entire life into recreating, constructing and bringing to the world the power of the ancient Crete and Minoan civilization, roughly 1900s. We're going to be looking at the palace of the mythical king, one of our earliest architects way before Vitruvius. Vitruvius in the ancient world of Rome, of course, was Vitruvius in the 1st century AD. He was an architect. Daedalus was the very first architect, a mythological architect that, of course, designed and built this palace and this labyrinth to house the Minotaur. Of course, this is from mythology, but it's really hard to understand what the building was built for when you look at the floor plans. Lions Gate, we're looking at the Bronze Age. Of course, I mentioned a mixture of tin and copper as a stronger material for making swords and war materials. So we're looking at is, let's take a look at the architectural structure of, I'll just kind of flip through these. This is not that large a dome, but for 1500 BC, this is way before the ancient Romans were building with arches and concrete domes. We've seen the ancient Roman culture in the 1st century AD. Apollodorus designed the Pantheon during Rome in the 1st century AD, but we're looking at the first rounded dome cylindrical structure. This is 1500 BC. This is made of different stones. Of course, it's carved out of the ground and reinforced with individual pieces of probably an early limestone. This is for the treasury of Artrius in 1500 BC. This is, again, the island of Crete, not in Egypt. But the plan, of course, is an emphatic circle. Of course, it's a pointed dome. So what we're looking at is probably the world's earliest dome. I might be wrong about that. But the way this thing is constructed, we're looking at what's called corbelling. Now, corbelling is a method of construction. If you look at the triangle, the corbels stack on top of each other. If we're to cut a rectilinear opening, we don't have a large lintel to span except for the large lintel that creates the opening. But the stones are pretty much stacked sequentially about 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 of an inch away from each other. So that way the corbelling makes the dome structure possible. Now remember, from ancient Roman societies, these were bricks that were filled with concrete. They didn't have concrete then, so to do this was a remarkable structure. This is the entry into the gate, of course, the treasury of Artis, which of course you have no idea the shape of this space upon entering. And this is roughly about 45 feet in diameter. The Pantheon is probably twice that large, 150 or 3 times that large, 150 feet in diameter. But it's interesting to see that none of the ancient Egyptian buildings were built with curves or domes. I'm assuming that they didn't have the technology to build with curves and domes back then. They were comfortable building with, steel, or I'm sorry, with post and lintel and stone and limestone. But this is a very unique sort of building in the landscape of the world of architecture. Of course, these stones were chiseled out of probably the hillside to reinforce the earth. But we're still looking at one of the earliest forms of construction, the dome. So here is the Palace of the Minotaur, a very unique sort of architectural typology. This is one image. This has been recreated. Sir Arthur Evans, basically with a lot of his apprentices, reconstructed some of the portions of this enormous palace for, of course, the mythological beast, the Minotaur. This is, 2,000 years before the ancient Egyptians really introduced their sort of early classical language. So we're looking at what's called inverted classical. Because remember, in ancient Greece and Romans, the tapering is from the bottom to the top. But this is quite the opposite. It's interesting that, I'm thinking that there was still a very primitive society, but they had the foresight and to make columns and have them polychrome. But look at the frieze is decorated with a consecutive series of round circles, a very kind of unique original language. Here's the plan of the labyrinth for the Minotaur that was, speculated that Arthur Evans attributed Daedalus as the first design. That's very strange. It's not a plan of spaces. The only spatial contract, of course, is the central court. The north entrance is the entry into this labyrinth. I'm assuming this is to contain and house the Minotaur, but functionally and literally, we're looking at storage units, probably an early sort of market storage units. There probably were some primitive banks, merchants. It's a very bizarre sort of floor plan, but we're still looking at the emphatic orthogonal. We're not looking at a crazy arrangement of primitive parts, where they were able to use a primitive sort of transits to lay out these dimensions. Of course, this is the section that Arthur Evans recreated. I think he probably visited there in the 1800s. But this is what a section of the Palace for the Minotaur used to look like. A very powerful sort of language. This is another reconstruction. It's, for 2,000 years, I mean, they were able to carve in primitive materials, face them with limestone, polychrome them. And of course, this is really, they weren't using hieroglyphics, they were using literal images to convey a certain amount of language. I'm not sure they were using hieroglyphics in Crete at this time, probably not. But you can see that this is an extraordinary, elaborate level of a trabeated system. The trabeated system is the post and lintel that stacks on top of each other. So several different layers of plan configurations and inverted columns. Then here's an interior view of some of the, obviously these are dolphins in the Mediterranean, and we can see that these are polychromed. They're definitely beyond the stage of survival. This is, of course, a creation of what the buildings plan the entire rendering used to look like. It's interesting back then, we're not seeing any fortified walls at all. They probably were not afraid of outside invaders, because normally you would see a large citadel with a huge, enormous stone wall with battlements. There are little battlements on top of each one of the buildings, but there's not a large fortified city wall around this. It's an interesting cultural dynamic. It's interesting to see the way things are constructed. This is, I'm glad we still have partial fragments to show the way things are physically built. We see layers of horizontal stone for the lintels infilled with just infill material. Of course, we don't have concrete back then, so they pretty much use very primitive. It's interesting that as primitive as they were, they still were able to taper the columns and paint them different colors. This is called the famous Lion's Gate. This is a Lion's Gate around the different sections of Crete, but we can see that, of course, they're using very primitive tools. They're not building them as sophisticated as the ancient Egyptians. They're not facing them with pristine limestone. But when you look at these images, it looks like a very kind of, very primitive way of a post-lintel construction. But you have to imagine some of these stones were roughly 2,000 pounds. You have to think, how on earth did someone without power tools or steel frames and cranes lift these things into place just to get that one lintel over there? Must have been a monumental task. These are some other images of the walls or frescoes that were painted in some of the spaces. Now we're looking at the painting of the bull and of course some of the people that inhabited there. And of course, these tell the language of how they functioned in society. They had, very sophisticated vessels that probably filled with olive oil. But of course, we're not using hieroglyphics. We're using graphic images to explain the story of how they actually occupied these buildings and lived in a certain primitive society. Now, these are little pieces of cuneiform writing in the ancient Sumerians. So, we're still not looking at a very formalized language that the Greeks established roughly 800 BC. We're still looking at some very primitive text and letters and symbols. And here's some other little primitive carvings. Then, of course, these are redrawn by archaeologists later to sort of this. I think in ancient Minoan societies, they had two different languages, Linear A, which is somewhat undecipherable. This is Linear A. This is a language, Linear B, which is a little bit clearer to read and understand. Of course, we did have archaeologists and historians to kind of figure out and kind of decipher what each one of these symbols meant. But, we're still looking at thousands of years of drawings and not a formal standard system of lettering. Of course, here's a map of the different places, the pyramids of Giza. There's some other images, just absolutely magnificent works. This is still done with clay and mud, not limestone and marble. This is a wonderful graphite drawing showing the way that these used to look. This is a reconstructed drawing showing that they're painted. They're polychrome with hieroglyphics, and especially the really original columnar orders. Of course, the capitals that are stylized leaf forms and probably papyrus reeds. Wow, look at that image. Look at that level of craft and detail. There again is Queen Hatshepsut's temple. Part of it is subtracted from the earth. A lot of it is added. When I look at this, just the scale of these structures against the people, and again, I love to look at, they have a certain enigmatic quality just looking at the black and white photographs. I think this probably was the early 1900s. But here's another reconstruction of some of the, I think this is the Temple of Luxor with the hypostyle halls. Here's another reconstruction, surprisingly with palm trees, or probably papyrus trees. Yeah, this is an interesting, what I'm calling a triglyph of the three different scenes. Sir Arthur Evans, the archaeologist that discovered or recreated the Minoan civilization, the Cyclops, another mythological figure, and of course, the famous Minotaur, half man and I think half bull. Of course, there's a photograph of Sir Arthur Evans. I'm sorry, I was mistaken. I think he discovered this roughly the early 1900s. I mistakenly said 1750. I was confusing that with the excavations in Pompeii, but this is definitely Arthur Evans roughly around the early 1900s. Here is a wooden reconstruction of the entire palace of the Labyrinth of the Minotaur in ancient Greece. It's enormous. Several different layers, of course, the trabeated post and lintel system of construction. I think we're probably running out of images. There's another image of the Palace of the Minotaur. These are probably some drawings done by the famous Piranesi in the 1700s. Okay, I think we are almost out of time. We have about 5 more minutes. Do you have any questions or comments, or do you want me to sift back to some of the slides? I just find it remarkable that the beginnings of creation really start with drawings, not really text and verbiage. And again, this is a very abbreviated introduction to the enormous culture that ancient Egypt has, created for the world, especially the ancient Minoans and the Sumerians. And again, each student will have access to the PowerPoints because I know the foundation would like you to remember specific dates, the names, and of course, the different dynasties and the time periods. So do you guys have any questions? Because next week we're going to be talking about ancient Greece and early Roman civilization. You're going to see a major structural and spatial change just due to the fact of the materials that were created there. I hope I did ancient Egypt justice because, we didn't talk about really gold. We didn't talk about how the fact that glass was actually created by having little pieces of sand that congealed on an oven and made a translucent surface, which of course became glass. They did wonderful advancements in technology with just some few materials that they had available to them.
This is Rafael from Houston. I have just a quick question.
Sure.
The treasury of Artraeus, was that a Minoan structure?
Yes.
It was, okay.
Yeah, that was not in Egypt. That's in the island of Crete. Yeah, this is not done by the Egyptians. This is done by the ancient Minoans. But the thing about, if you look at the maps, I mean, they are relatively close to each other, but it was difficult to travel back then. I mean, the island of Crete, to me, looks like, if you look at the maps, again, that's a pretty far distance for just primitive ships to travel from Crete into Egypt. I'm sure the ancient Egyptians probably visited there and could probably see the dome constructed. But I'm just thinking, why didn't they incorporate that physical ideology into building some of their structures? But it's interesting. There's a lot of mysteries. I'm not really sure why, but yeah. So the round underground temple is really here on the island of Crete, built by the Minoans.
Thank you.
Okay, anyone else? I was going to share with you, there's an extraordinary, it's called a Visible Encyclopedia of the History of the World Architecture. I can send you an email, but pretty much it has all different types of construction. I didn't have, it's probably 1,000 pages. I wanted to upload images of ancient Greece and all these engravings, but it would have taken me 2 months to scan all those in. I'll type it in the email after the PowerPoint that Valerie is going to be getting together, but there's a wonderful, it's called a pictorial encyclopedia. It has nothing but extraordinary engravings. It is called the Complete Encyclopedia of Illustration, roughly done engravings from the 1700s to the early 1900s. But I'll give you a list of bibliographies for that book. It's really a powerful sort of learning tool to see all these things drawn with this extraordinary light and shade. This is a very primitive drawing done with probably an ink quill and a pen. So this is not done with modern rapidograph pens or microns that you get at Azel Art or something. But, this culture was absolutely extraordinary. I mean, look at that section. This is just baffling to think that this is how you would actually lift one piece of granite up like that. Any other questions or?
Can you say the name of the book that you were just talking about again? What's the title?
Yeah, let me go to the last. I'll just type it in. Oh, let's see. I can actually give you probably the ISBN number too.
Okay, good. Thank you.
The author is J.G. Heck. And it's from Gramercy Books. Can you see this on the screen?
Yes.
And let me see what the number is. Okay, the ISBN number is okay, so I want you to do the quiz for you is to rewrite the numbers in ancient hieroglyphics. I know you can do that. Okay, did you get that? And this will be saved. This is just a remarkable book of drawing. And also the other Sphinx drawing, this is just an outstanding book that was written in the 1920s. It's called Rendering in Pen and Ink. And it's a course by the famous Arthur Gouptool that has outstanding drawings in ink. I mean, unbelievable stuff that will just blow your mind away. But it does have some ancient Egyptian temples and, of course, the Great Sphinx. Rendering in Pink by Arthur. And if you go, you're going to be seeing that since books are rare, I've seen some of these books are available for $1,000 because they're out of print and everyone just Googles everything, which I find a shame. But I'll give you the ISBN number for this one too. It is, but it's definitely worth getting. Okay, well, I can't believe that that's all the questions you guys have. If you don't have questions, I hope you start seeing architecture in kind of a more enlightened way. These are just extraordinary sculptures, buildings, and the ideas behind these constructions are just remarkable. For everyone in the class and anyone in architecture, this is an outstanding visual documentary of the entire world of architecture. And there's ships, boats, there's cranes. I mean, the entire world is beautifully drawn and illustrated in this one book, Encyclopedia of Illustrations. It's definitely a very important book to get. Okay, well, Valerie, I guess this is the end of the lecture, and if there aren't any questions, it is, I think, a little bit after 1. Valerie, do you have any questions?
No, this was amazing. I have like screenshot a couple of these photos because they're so cool because I want them now.
Oh,
But
yeah, great.
Thank
Well,
you, Jay. I
yeah.
appreciate it.
You're welcome. Okay, well, I guess I want, before we leave, I do want to end with this, especially this discussion of drawing as a way of communication. 14, come on, Jay, 14,000 years of drawings, how vital that is. And I teach modern architecture in the afternoons, and I still have my modern architecture students draw classical subjects. It's very important. And I want you to remember this image burned into your brain. Okay, well, everyone, thanks for attending. I will see you next Tuesday. We're going to be talking about ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And I look forward to seeing everyone again.
Thank you, Jay.
Thank you.
You're welcome.